So we're continuing our stewardship series on these upward spirals of faith and grace and love. And this is as opposed to what we often hear as downward spirals that happen when things kind of go awry. And so what we're looking at is how we care for our lives faithfully and what that does to lift us up, what that does to improve our community, to improve our community of faith, to improve our families. And today, any guess what we're going to be talking about today? Talents? Words? Okay? We're going to be talking about words. And some people have a talent with words. Okay? We're going to talk about how we use our language, how we use our conversation. Did any of you listen to that passage from James? How aggressive is James in talking about how we use our language? He says our tongues are set on fire by hell itself. That's not too subtle a way of saying that our language can be very, very problematic. And I'm going to preface the sermon today with this, with a question. How many of you have ever said something that you immediately regret? How many have opened your mouth and had to shoot an email or a phone call and say, that was a little bit out of line? Okay? So what we're about to look at today, what I'm about to preach on, if you feel at some point that you've had your toes stepped on or you've been kicked in the shins, trust me, everybody else is feeling it at some point as well. Because we're talking about something here that is a human condition. And James says it very well at the beginning. He said, anybody that can control their tongue is a perfect person in every other way. Because it is so easy for us to let things out of our mouth, to buy into things that cause us to say things we regret or not say things, which is another side to this. Just lost my train of thought for a second. So, but my point is that we're all in this together. And there's not anybody in this room that has not made a misstep in their speech. And the reality of it is it's so critical that if we're able to control our language, it means we have everything else under control. And it's because, and I think this is very accurate, Scripture also tells us that our words flow from the abundance of our heart. And so if we can get our heart and our actions under control, our words are going to follow suit. But we're all struggling in our own ways. And so what we're going to do this morning is we're going to take a look at this passage in 2 Timothy where Paul says that people are going to be led to embrace myths and go away from sound doctrine. And that a lot of it is because people are just going to have itching ears. They're just going to want to hear what they want to hear. And so there's two sides to this. We're going to talk mainly about the speaking side, but I want you to keep in the back of your mind that there's also the receiving side. And are we really willing to hear things that may make us uncomfortable? Because if we're not, that can contribute to people not telling us what we need to hear. And we're going to see how that plays out in a minute. So we're going to look at this word myth to begin. And I think there's really two kinds of myth. We're not talking about myth like, are you worshiping the sun god Apollo? We're not talking about, are you buying into Aesop's fables as if they are another gospel? What we're going to talk about is this word myth in terms of a story that has a kernel of truth that exaggerates the truth so that we really get it, or a story or a belief that has a kernel of truth and twists that truth in a way that is damaging. And that's the second one we're going to look at. We're going to look at four, I think, very common Christian myths this morning. And the first one is this. It's also a very American myth. Saying it is as good as doing it. Saying it is as good as doing it. Have you ever experienced this? Let me give you an example. When you move your house, how often does it happen that you've asked 20 people if they'll help? Maybe all 20 say yes. How many show up? 3. All right? Saying it's good as doing it. I said I would do it. Sometimes we believe that if we speak, if we can articulate our faith very well, it means that we actually are living our faith very well. And that's not necessarily the case. But there's this kind of thing going on in our country, and it's not just in matters of faith, it's overall, that if I can convince you that I am such and such, as long as I can perpetuate that with my words, I don't actually have to do anything about it. Just got to convince you. And that happens a lot of times, I think, in matters of faith, where we say things that sound good, and we say it because they sound good. Or someone asks us to do something, and we say, okay, because we feel like, I probably should do that. But once it's out of our mouths, it's very quickly to the back burner. And if we don't follow through, what we're trusting in is that we're not going to be held accountable to it, or the person's going to forget the conversation. And the issue with this myth is that when that is what we do, especially if it's a business, what we engage in is a deception. We engage in the deception of ourselves and of other people because we're leading folks down a certain way of thinking, and we're not following through. Or, we're very good at throwing out a bunch of ideas or making committals of our time, but then expecting other people to do the work or to pick up my slack if I don't show. And that eats away at the fabric of ministry and of our community. Now, I'm going to give you two examples of where when our words and our actions don't line up, and as far as what this can look like. Last Easter, I'm going to say who, because it's not relevant to the illustration. The week after Easter, I was talking to one of our youngsters, and I said, "How was your Easter?" And they said, "It was great." "Well, what did you do?" And I was asking because I was hoping they had a great Easter, first of all, but I also knew they weren't in church on Easter Sunday. So my hope was what I was going to do was, well, we were out of town visiting relatives, and this youngster says to me, well, we were opening our Easter baskets and eating lots of candy. And I said, well, why weren't you in church on Easter? And the response was, why on earth would you go to church on Easter? Now, some of you are chuckling, and some of you are squirming, and some of you don't know quite what to think. I'm not making that statement as a statement of anything other than this. I don't think that there was any malintent on the part of what was happening in that household and all that more. I know that the language is very faithful, but what happens is, in one act, what was communicated was, if something more fun comes along, we just skip church, even if it's Easter Sunday. And that's a powerful statement to me, especially since I've got young kids myself. Now I'm going to throw myself under the bus with this next one, just to drive the point home. Most of you know that before I came over here, I was doing chaplain's work out in Baltimore. And I lived about an hour away from my place of employment. And so my job was ministry. And so my life was entrenched in the gospel. It was entrenched in trying to live out my call. It was entrenched in communicating the things of God to people. But what it also did was give me a really convenient excuse not to go to church on Sunday mornings. Because I had about an hour drive. And so when I have to be at work at 12:30 or 1, and I'm not sure if church is going to be, done at 11 or 11:30 or whatever, it's a very convenient excuse to say, oh, well, I got to go to work, and I am living out the gospel in my life, and so that makes it okay. But the problem is this, and I wish somebody in that congregation would have said this to me. Nobody looked at me and said, you realize, Brent, that it's not about you. You may be living your faith in your daily life, but what about your kids, and what about your wife that are following your cue? They're not working with you. They're not entrenched in ministry every day. You're keeping them at home so you can sleep a little longer, or whatever my real excuse was. But nobody said that to me. Nobody said that to me. Nobody held me accountable to make my actions and my words line up. I could articulate why it was important for people to be involved in ministry and community of faith very, very well. But when I wasn't doing it in my own life, nobody pulled me up. I was sending a bad message to my family. I could speak it really well, but my actions said a whole lot more. And that's the damage that comes in with saying is as good as doing. People look at who we are and what we do as much as, if not more than our words, when they're paying attention. And this regret that I never heard anybody call me out leads to our second myth. Our second myth is this: good Christians don't ruffle each other's feathers. Conflict is bad. Okay? Now, have any of you experienced this one? Let me put it a different way. How many of you have ever had something really bearing on your heart? You've been offended, you've been hurt by somebody, but you didn't say anything because you were afraid the other person was going to get mad at you. That ever happened? Or how many times have we felt like, and I know this, and this is one of the great things about the openness of our discussion groups, and some people have remarked about this, that why they're glad for that openness, because there's many times when we have things that hit us. The Spirit is driving us in a direction where we hear something another Christian says, and something saying, that doesn't sound right to me. Something seems a little bit off. But we're afraid to make that known. Because what if it ruffles somebody's feathers? What if it makes for an awkward moment? We don't like awkward moments. We don't like conflict. And so there's this idea that if we're Christians, everything should just go along very happy and very hunky-dory. And Karen and I should never have an honest word with each other, because what if I make her mad? Or what if she makes me mad? And that is very alive and well in the Christian community. Now, where this does damage, this downward spiral piece, is this: how do we solve problems if we don't know what they are? How do we forgive one another if we don't know that we've wronged somebody? How do we grow in faith if we're never comfortable with asking questions? How does our community expand and grow in depth if we can't be vulnerable to one another? And so when we buy into this myth, what happens is we lead to this pain and problems that fester. Let me ask you something. Do y'all know what a parking lot meeting is? You know what parking lot meetings are? They happen for about 30 minutes right after a committee meeting in the church. They happen for about 20 minutes after any church event. And it's when we go out and we talk to each other and we grouse about why somebody was out of line, why we didn't agree with something, why something wasn't done right. And we go back and forth. And all the things that should have come out in the meeting happen in the parking lot. And don't do any good. and now, I do want to make a little bit of a caveat on here. Sometimes those meetings are people processing through what had happened in a way that's intentionally being productive. They're sorting through their thoughts, sifting through their emotions, so that they can take action to do something about whatever is unsettled them. But other times, it's just kind of getting some venom out. It's where gossip is born. Because when we're angry and frustrated, okay, are we going to be quiet about it? Most of us aren't. The question is, where are we going to voice it? And how are we going to voice it? Because when we voice it correctly, things improve. Now, here's something that's happened in many, many churches, and this is a very real thing. When people get offended in a relationship, okay, if it does not correct, what will happen to the relationship? Will it go on or will it break? Break. It's going to be happens in churches all the time. Okay? Now, I know this is going to shock you, but sometimes we hurt each other's feelings. Right? We offend each other. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. But what happens is, if we buy into this myth that we have to suffer in silence because conflict is bad, then here's what happens. When people come to us and ask us what's wrong, and it could be a pastor, it could be any people in a congregation, we give one of two answers. Nothing is wrong? Brent, what's going on? I can tell you something's been bothering you. Nope, everything's okay. Brent, what's going on? What's bothering you? You know what? I'm upset, but I just really don't want to talk about it. I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, so let's just leave it be. If I never talk about it, if I never get at the root of what's going on, I'm never going to find peace with the situation. And it's going to grow, and it's going to grow, and it's going to grow. And then beyond that, whatever's happening that caused that aggravation is going to continue to cause other people aggravation. And so it just continues to spiral underneath the surface and fester until something breaks, until something, more happens. That's the danger of this particular myth. And it's why we need to stay away from it. The next two are much shorter, and I'm hoping this next one you get a little chuckle out of it. They did it on Monday night. I was reminded of a great expression. It's a myth in a Christian church. How many of you have heard the term hatch, match, and dispatch? You know hatch, match? Okay? There's this idea for some people in the Christian faith that the reason we go to church is so we have someone to bless our baptisms, to bless our weddings, and to bless our bodies when we die. They hatch us, then they match us, then they dispatch us. Here's where that myth is dangerous, because what we do is now we're attributing power to words that doesn't exist. What we're saying is that if we have the right person say the right thing at the right time, God is going to bless everything from that moment onward, regardless of how we act. So, if I say, if I baptize, but we don't ever see that youngster in church, or it's very, very splotchy, the baptism doesn't really take. And the proof of this is if you take a look at where the biggest drain in the Christian church is right now, it's youth and young adults that don't continue on in faith when they start to come of age. And a lot of that's because of how we follow up with them after their baptism or not. If I bless a wedding and I bless a marriage, and then one or both spouses decide they don't want to honor those marriage vows, what good is the blessing? It's not much good, because they're not intent on keeping that covenant. If you want proof of this, look at our divorce rates. The last one is that if you think that I can preach somebody into heaven or out of it, you don't know me very well. Okay? There is not a person or pastor on this earth that has the word that can save or condemn another person. That is between us and God as individuals. And so what we can do is we can honor God, we can revere God, we can help God's grace become apparent in these moments. And God will honor that. But the reality is that our blessing and God's work in our lives is not a momentary thing. It's a day-to-day thing in how we live and what we do and who we are. And that's what honors the blessing of God. And the danger of buying into the hatch, match, and dispatch myth is that it absolves us of responsibility as Christians. We don't have to act on our faith. Somebody else does it for us. The last one is this. How many of you have heard the term righteous indignation? Holy anger. Divine wrath. Anybody ever get so upset inside because something was so out of step with your Christian perspective? You get angry? Now there's two ways to deal with it. The righteous indignation is actually the exact opposite of don't cause wave. Righteous indignation says, When I'm upset, that's the Spirit leading me to speak out. And if the Spirit makes me say something hateful or disrespectful or rude or mean-spirited, don't blame me. That's God speaking through me. And if you're upset with it, that's your problem. Because you're the one that's out of line. You ever meet someone like that? How's that come across? Not too good. It's a myth. It's wrong. Because it leads to hurt and heartbreak and anger, and we drive people away. And we forget something really important. When Jesus was speaking to most people who were out of line, did he speak with compassion or love? He spoke with compassion and love. The ones that he got really, really torqued off at were the religious people that were pointing the bony finger. That's the ones he came after. And so this righteous indignation is a myth that eats away at the credibility and the fabric of the gospel of our Christian community. Now, I'm going to take a pause here. I had a great question. I will say yes. I had a question. I put this on Facebook last night on the church page, on my page, and sent an email out. Many of you may have got it, telling you we were going to do our 4 myths this morning. And I had a question. I hope he's okay with me pointing from our beloved Don Anderson. Do we get to vote on it? So what we're going to vote on is which of these myths do you think is the most problematic, the most heinous, the one that causes the most waves? So we have 4. We have the myth of, I say it and it's as good as doing it. We have the myth of Christians don't ruffle feathers. We have the myth of hatch, match, and dispatch. And we have the myth of righteous anger. How many of you think that the most problematic one is saying it is as good as doing it? Okay, we got a couple. Come on, be bold! All right? How many of you think that Christians don't make waves? Christians don't ruffle feathers is the biggest problem. All right, we got a few take good on there. How many hatch, match, and dispatchers do we got? All right, we got a couple of hatch, match, and dispatchers. How many of you think righteous indignation is the biggest problem? How many of you didn't vote? Okay? We had a pretty even smattering there. Well, the point is they all carve away at the fabric of our community of faith. Now, here's the thing. I said each of them has a kernel of truth. The kernel of truth in the first one, which is saying is as good as doing, is that it is important for us to speak our faith. It is important for us to be able to articulate what we believe and why. It is important for us to be able to speak in a way that has integrity and lines up with the gospel. That is true. But we have to make sure our actions follow suit. It is true that we should not speak in a way that is intentionally offensive. We should not be intentionally malicious. We should measure our words in the spirit in which they are said so that they are going to be received correctly. That's the kernel of truth, and don't make waves and don't ruffle feathers. However, if that's all the farther it goes, then we miss out on Christian accountability and what it means to really heal wounds that happen when we offend one another. Because it's going to happen. The hatch, match, and dispatch, the kernel of truth is this. Yes, it is important. Those moments, communion, baptism, marriage, celebrations of life, those are all incredibly important moments, services, ceremonies, sacraments. Every single one of those is necessary. And yes, it is important to pay attention to the language that we use. As your pastor, it is important for me to intentionally consider the words that I use in those moments to minister to you, because how we speak inspires, it motivates, it brings and cultivates a mood, and it can bring us into the presence of God and the grace of God in a way that other things cannot. It's important. But if all we focus on is the warm fuzzy in the moment and forget that there's follow-up in our own lives, that's where the problem comes in. Finally, righteous indignation. Is anger a good and healthy thing? What do you think? Yes? No? Some of you are confusing anger with rage and hate. Yeah, if it's handled right, it's a great thing. Anger is the fuel through which some of the greatest change in this world have been made. Because something wells up inside And when we do, great things can happen. But where the myth goes too far is it says we don't have to temper our anger with grace and compassion and love, in a sense that justice is more than one way. So there's a kernel of truth in all of those. Now what I want to encourage us in this morning is this, because Paul gives us, James tells us the effects of it. If we don't control what we say, things go bonkers. Paul gives us the response. Paul tells us, correct, rebuke, and encourage with great patience and careful instruction. Paul tells us how we are supposed to intentionally live out our gospel faith in the things and the words that we use and that we say. When we think about the gospel, when Jesus was speaking to his disciples in the book of John, he said, "This is how people will know you have faith in me." What did he say? Was it because you say all the right things? No. He said, because you will live in love, you will live in humility, you will live in compassionate service. And when those are the things that guide everything we do and everything we say, a lot of these things sort themselves out. Because we realize that our words are not just words, they're a covenant. They are a bond that we form with God and with one another. And so if I give you my word, if I tell you I will be there, I will do something, if I offer a suggestion and I passionately believe in it, then I will also back it up with my actions. Our words become something that is representative of the depth of our faith and the depth and passion of our commitment. When we were willing to be vulnerable and confessional and forgiving and grace-filled and merciful with one another, we don't have to fear conflict. Because now, whenever somebody upsets me, if I can go and speak to them truthfully and honestly, I don't have to worry about them jumping down my throat. Because they are going to be realizing that their response should be laced with compassion and mercy and grace and love and forgiveness. And the same comes for me. I don't go to somebody so that I can berate them. I go to somebody so we can heal the wounds that have happened in our relationship. And the more confessional and open and grace-filled we are with each other, the more we're going to feel that coming from God. When everything that I say and everything that I do becomes a whole